Think about those images we see every Christmas. 3 kings, a stable, a manger. It's a classic scene, right? But here is the reality. That image is almost entirely absent from the Bible. If you open the book of Matthew, the only place the story of the Star of Bethlehem is actually recorded, you'll find that the text contains only 12 verses regarding the wise men and the star. Just 12. When you look at the original Greek, the term used is Magi or Magi. It refers to wise men from the east, in the plural, but without any specific count. Matthew chapter 2 doesn't specify how many there were, what their names were, or even that they were kings. No mention of 3 kings at all. And the most surprising part? The wise men found Jesus in a house, not in a manger. The Greek word used is oion, meaning a residence or dwelling. The tradition we've inherited is a beautiful painting, but the actual record is something far more strange and specific. Before we dive deeper, consider subscribing to the channel to explore more hidden histories. To understand who these men really were, we have to shift our gaze to the Iranian plateau. We aren't talking about 3 monarchs, but a specialized priestly caste. The term Magi appears in stone inscriptions ordered by Darius the Great at Behistun, dating back to 520 BC, which provides us with hard historical evidence of this specific class of men. It's fascinating how we've completely shifted the meaning of the word over 2 millennia. The English term Magi entered our language from Latin around 1200 AD in the context of the Gospel of Matthew, and magus is a Latinized form of the ancient Greek word magoi. That Greek word was actually a transliteration of an Iranian original. Because of this, the word magic is derived from magus, but the original Magian priests had nothing to do with wizardry or spells in the way we think of them today. Instead, a magus was a member of an ancient Persian clan specializing in cultic activities. They were the supreme authorities in religious and celestial matters, serving as high-level advisors to the Persian Empire's royal court. From the time of Darius I onwards, the Magi were the official priests of the Achaemenid kings. Beyond their religious duties, they managed complex administrative and economic activities. I've always found it striking how precise they were. They weren't just wise men in a general sense. They were the intellectual elite of their entire world. This priestly caste remained influential through the Seleucid, Parthian, and Sasanian periods. Under the Parthians and Sasanians, the term magus was used specifically for Zoroastrian priests, sometimes called Mobed or Magupati, the chief of the Magi. They were the only group of priests in both Media and Persia, with the exception of priests of ancient local cults in Elamite regions. Their identity is so deeply rooted in history that the term magus appears in documents written in Old Persian, Elamite, Akkadian, Aramaic, Parthian, and Sasanian, as well as in texts from classical antiquity. Herodotus of Halicarnassus wrote about them in the 5th century BC, noting their role in sacrifices. It's a clear picture, a professional class of astronomer priests who read the sky to understand the same patterns that governed the royal courts of the Iranian plateau. These men weren't just stargazers. They were deeply rooted in Zoroastrianism, believing in one supreme god called Ahura Mazda. In modern terms, we'd call them astrologers, but for them, it was a high-stakes intellectual pursuit. They weren't simply waiting for any savior. They were searching for a very specific kind. of Redeemer. Zoroastrianism taught the coming of a savior known as a Sashant, a future benefactor. The Avestan term is Saoshyant, and in Middle Persian, it's Soshants. I'm not entirely sure how the timing aligns perfectly, but consider this. Zarathustra, or Zoroaster, is himself a Saoshyant. He works toward the Frasho-Karati, which is essentially the restoration of the world, where existence is rehabilitated and made splendid. Later Zoroastrian tradition expanded the number of Saoshyants from 1 to 3. And this is where it gets weird. All Saoshyants are born from the seed of Zarathustra, which is preserved in Lake Konsoya, which we now identify as Lake Helmand in Sistan, Iran. This seed is protected by 99,999 Fravashis, or guardian spirits. It's a level of mythological detail that makes the Three Kings story feel almost simplistic by comparison. Let's look at the sky of 7 BC. For the Magi of Babylonia, the heavens weren't just a view, they were a coded royal telegram. In that year, something truly striking happened. A triple conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn occurred in the constellation of Pisces. Here is the detail that changed everything. A triple conjunction isn't a simple meeting of planets. It happens when Earth is on the same side of the Sun as Jupiter and Saturn, causing 3 conjunctions in a single year. In May, October, and December of 7 BC, these 2 bright objects came close together 3 times. To the unaided eye, it looked like Jupiter and Saturn were changing direction in the night sky. This happens because Earth overtakes the other planets in their orbits. In a triple conjunction, Jupiter overtakes Saturn, then Earth overtakes both, causing them to appear to move backwards, what astronomers call retrograde, before resuming normal motion. I wonder if we can truly grasp the rarity of this. While Jupiter and Saturn align in conjunction once every 20 years or so, a triple conjunction of this specific kind occurs approximately every 900 years. The cycle is even longer when you look at the big picture. Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions begin a new cycle back at nearly their original position relative to the vernal equinox after approximately 794.4 years. They also shift westward, clockwise, through the signs of a given trigon, remaining in one trigon for almost 200 years. But why did this matter to the Magi? Because in Babylonian astrology, Jupiter represented Marduk, the supreme god, and Saturn represented Kaiwanu, the star of justice and royalty. When these two aligned in the constellation of Pisces, which was associated with the land of the Jews, Syria and Palestine, it was a royal message. This aligned perfectly with Numbers 24:17, which prophesied that a star would come out of Jacob and a scepter would rise out of Israel. Essentially, the significance of the Star of Bethlehem was only obvious to the Magi of Babylonia. They had the math, they had the libraries. Based on these astronomical events, it's probable that Jesus Christ was born in the autumn of 7 BC, around October. Wait, there's more. In early 6 BC, Mars began to approach Jupiter and Saturn. By late February and early March of 6 BC, Mars overtook Saturn and then Jupiter, allowing 3 planets to set together in the west after sunset. This entire sequence of astronomical data was later analyzed and published in Nature, Volume 264, Issue 5586, pp 513 to 517 in December 1976. It wasn't just a legend, It was a precise calculation. Up until now, we've been talking about the planets, but this is where the narrative shifts into something far more unsettling. According to the writings of Origen, the Magi realized their magical power was weakening when the star appeared, which forced them to dig back into their ancient books. It's a strange detail, but it signals a transition. The Star of Bethlehem was not a natural astronomical object because it moved and stopped over a specific house. This isn't a textbook case of planet alignment. When the Gospel of Matthew describes how the star went before them and stood over where the young child was, the Magi weren't just following a coordinate, they were being guided. I've always wondered about the gap between the data and the experience. If you use the program Stellarium to simulate the sky as a planetarium, you can map out the stars, but a simulation cannot account for a light that physically leads a caravan from Persia to Israel over a period of time. This is where the scholars step in. Since the 13th century, people have been debating what this light actually was. If we assume the event was natural, we have a few options. First, it could be a supernova, a comet, a solar flare, or an alignment of planets. But there's one thing it definitely couldn't have been: a meteor. Professor David Hughes, an astronomer from the University of Sheffield, published a review of these theories in the 1970s. He points out that a bright comet is a strong candidate. Comets, which he describes as big, dirty snowballs flying through space, have a tail that points away from the sun. Hughes notes that these tails and the coma can make a comet appear to stand over the Earth. We actually have a record of this. Astronomers in China recorded a bright comet in the constellation of Capricorn in 5 BC. There's also Halley's Comet, which was visible around 12 BC, though it's considered less likely. But here's the problem. The Magi were expert astrologers. They knew that comets were commonly associated with the 4 Ds: doom, death, disease, and disaster. A comet would have been seen as a bad omen, not a sign of the birth of the King of the Jews. That's why Tim O'Brien from the Jodrell Bank Observatory in Cheshire suggests looking at the visual impact of 2 bright objects coming together. Some point to the Great Conjunction of Venus and Jupiter on June 17th, 2 BC, where the two appeared almost as a single object. Others suggest a nova, the birth of a new star. It's almost a comical irony that since the 1940s, most planetariums in the Western world have presented shows about the Star of Bethlehem as a Christmas custom. Yet, as John Mosley, a program supervisor at Griffith Observatory, wrote in an article for the Planetarian in 1981, these shows are often full of common errors. When you strip away the science, you're left with the 4th century view of John Chrysostom, who described the star as the Shekinah glory of God taking visible form. For those Magi, it wasn't a calculation. It was a sign. 1,700 miles. That is the distance from Babylon to Jerusalem via trade routes, though a straight line would have been 1,300 miles. To put that in perspective, that's roughly the distance from New York City to Denver. Imagine the sheer scale of this journey. According to the book of Ezra 7:9, a trip like this took exactly 4 months. This wasn't a 3-man walking tour. It was a massive logistics operation. These priests likely traveled in a large caravan, with guards, servants, and camels to protect their treasures. Now, let's look at the gifts they brought: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. To obtain these, they would have had to tap into the incense trade route, an ancient network of land and sea routes linking the Mediterranean world with sources of luxury goods. This network stretched from Mediterranean ports across the Levant, Egypt, Northeast Africa, and Arabia to India and beyond. Here is where it gets incredibly specific. Frankincense and myrrh came from the southern Arabian Peninsula and the Somali coast. Greek texts and the Periplus Maris Erythraei refer to coastal sites in Somalia, southern Arabia, and India involved in the trade of frankincense, myrrh, cassia, bdellium, and gum resins like duaca, kenkaman, and mak-rotu. In the Hellenistic and Roman world, frankincense was considered a valuable product whose value exceeded that of gold. It was used for worship, medical, and cosmetic purposes. Looking at the route, Pliny the Elder recorded 65 stations along the incense route. We see the global scale of this trade. Indian goods, including spices, precious stones, pearls, ebony, silk, and fine textiles, were brought to Aden in Arabian and Indian vessels. Other goods were transshipped at the port of Ophir by the ships of Tarshish, a Tyrian fleet equipped at Ezion-Geber that traded gold, silver, ivory, and precious stones from the east. This trade was a high-stakes game. Between the 3rd century BC and the 2nd century AD, the incense land trade from South Arabia to the Mediterranean flourished. Important trading points like Gurha served as hubs on the route from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea. Other key stops included the Lyhianite Arab old town of Al-Ula in Saudi Arabia and Nabatean Arab cities in the Niqab, such as Subaida, which linked to the Mediterranean end of the route. We've even seen the Egyptians importing spices, gold, and exotic wood from Arabia and the land of Punt. In fact, frescoes dated to around 1500 BC in the temple at Thebes commemorate a fleet sent by the Queen of Egypt to the land of Punt. The Thebes temple reliefs depict 5 ships piled high with treasure, including one ship carrying 31 small incense trees in tubs. Everything points to one thing. The demand for frankincense increased at the beginning of the 5th century BC, which led to an increase in the volume of traffic along these routes. When the Magi traveled, they weren't just carrying gifts. They were moving through the most sophisticated luxury corridor of the ancient world. This is a detail that really strikes me. These men weren't just following a star. They were navigating a map of global commerce. Imagine the scene. The Magi, having traveled from the east, specifically from areas that are now Iraq, Iran, Saudi Arabia, or Yemen, arrive in Jerusalem. These regions, then known as Persia, Arabia, and Sheba, produced some of the same Babylonians who were east of the Holy Land. But they didn't go straight to a stable. They went to the palace of Herod, the Roman-appointed ruler of the region. When the Magi inquired about the child born as King of the Jews with Herod, the atmosphere in the room must have been electric. They told him they had observed his star at its rising. and had come to pay him homage. I'm not entirely sure what Herod's immediate internal reaction was, but he was clearly disturbed by the arrival of the Magi and their search for the King of the Jews. He didn't want a rival. To find an answer, he gathered his chief priests and teachers of the law in Jerusalem. He asked them, "Where is the Christ?" These religious leaders in Jerusalem identified Bethlehem Ephratah as the birthplace of the Messiah based on Micah 5:2. Using Micah's prophecy, Herod's own wise men determined that the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem. The prophecy stated that a ruler who would be the shepherd of my people Israel would come from Bethlehem in the land of Judah. Now, look at the gap here. Bethlehem is located only 10 kilometers south of Jerusalem. That's a distance you could walk in a couple of hours. It's a bit unsettling. These priests knew exactly where the child was being born, yet they didn't make the journey. They had the map, but they lacked the will. Because of this, King Herod reluctantly provided the direction, but then he secretly asked the Magi for the exact time the star had appeared. He wasn't planning a worship service. He was planning a murder. Here is where the story diverges from the postcards. When the Magi finally arrived, they didn't find a newborn in a manger. The biblical text makes a very specific linguistic distinction here. In the Gospel of Matthew, the child is called Pedion, a word meaning a young child or little one, rather than braus, the word for a newborn baby used in the Gospel of Luke. This means the Magi arrived after Jesus' birth, likely months or even years later. Think about the logistics of that. Herod had sent the Magi to Bethlehem to search for Jesus, using them as a sort of human GPS to find the exact timing of the star's appearance. By the time they actually stepped inside that house, they weren't looking at a fragile infant, but a toddler. And the reaction of these high-status Persian priests was visceral. They didn't just bow, they performed pronousin. This was complete prostration, face to the ground, in a gesture of absolute submission. When you see these men, scholars of the royal courts, the intellectual elite of the East, literally hitting the dirt in prostration, you realize the scale of what they thought they had found. It wasn't a polite nod to a baby, it was the recognition of a king. Once they finally stepped inside that house, the Magi did something that felt almost instinctive. They didn't just bow, they performed pronousin, that complete prostration, face to the ground. It's a heavy, total surrender of the status they'd traveled 1,700 miles to leave behind. But the real story is in what they opened. These weren't just expensive treasures brought from the incense route, they were prophetic symbols. Gold, for instance, was a gift for a king. Then there was the incense, which was reserved for a god. And then, the most jarring detail, myrrh. In the ancient world, myrrh was used for embalming the dead. By bringing it to a toddler, they were essentially gifting something for someone who would eventually die. I find it fascinating that these men, who spent their lives reading the stars and ancient texts, didn't just bring luxury. They brought a coded message. It's as if they knew exactly what the trajectory of this child's life would be. the royalty, the divinity, and the inevitable end. They didn't just see a child, they saw the whole arc of a life that would end in a funeral. Herod the Great was not a man you wanted to cross. He was an Idumean, a descendant of Esau, and Rome had named him King of the Jews in 40 BC. To the world, he looked like a visionary builder. He renovated the temple in Jerusalem, constructed the Western Wall, and built massive fortifications like Caesarea Maritima, Masada, and Herodium. But if you look past the architecture, the rest of the story is a bloodbath. This man executed his favorite wife, Miriam, his mother-in-law, and 3 of his own sons. He didn't stop there. He purged 46 members of the Sanhedrin to maintain control. When the Magi arrived, Herod played his part. He lied to them, telling them to search for the child and report back so he could supposedly worship him too. But the lie was a calculation. Once the Magi were warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they took another route back to their country, leaving the great king in a state of agitated paranoia. This is where the story turns truly dark. Because Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea during the time of King Herod, the paranoid ruler decided to clear the board. He ordered the death of all newborn infants, killing all children in Bethlehem and surrounding areas from 2 years old and under. To give you an idea of the scale, Bethlehem had a population of approximately 300 people. Scholars estimate 20 to 40 boys were killed in the massacre. While the historian Flavius Josephus does not specifically mention the massacre of the innocents, he records other massacres by Herod that prove his pattern of behavior. This brutality fulfilled the prophecy of Jeremiah 31:15 regarding Rachel weeping for her children. Joseph and Mary, alerted to the danger, fled to Egypt. They found refuge in the massive Jewish communities in cities like Alexandria. Coptic tradition identifies 25 locations visited by the Holy Family in Egypt. But the terror didn't end with Herod's death. In 4 BC, King Herod died a grotesque death involving fever, itching, intestinal pains, and worms coming out of his body. His kingdom was then divided among his 3 sons, Archelaus, who took Judea and Samaria, Herod Antipas, who took Galilee, and Philip, who took the northeast territories. The legacy of blood continued. In the first 3 months of his reign, Archelaus massacred 3,000 Jews in the temple courtyard during Passover. The cycle of violence was just a brutal, atmospheric reality of the first century. It's time to strip away the layers of tradition and look at what's actually in the record. Most of us grew up with the image of 3 kings, but that's not where the story began. The tradition that the Magi were kings was actually developed in the 3rd century to fulfill Psalm 72:10-11. The Bible doesn't mention royalty, it mentions priests. And those names we've heard for centuries, Gaspar, Melchior, and Balthazar, they didn't appear in the Gospel of Matthew. They first appeared in a Latin manuscript in the 8th century. We're talking about a gap of several hundred years between the events and the names. Then there's the racial symbolism. The idea that the Magi represented 3 races was a later development from the Middle Ages. It was a way to make the story universal, but it wasn't part of the historical account. Now, this is where it gets weirdly concrete. Since 1164, Cologne Cathedral has housed the Shrine of the Three Kings, but when a reliquary was opened in 1864 in Cologne, it revealed 3 skulls, one young, one middle-aged, and one elderly. It's a strange physical remnant of how this legend grew into a tangible reality for millions of people. Meanwhile, the family of Jesus had moved on. They settled in Nazareth, fulfilling the prophecy that he shall be called a Nazarene, which connects back to the Hebrew word netzer, meaning branch. It's a stark contrast. While Europe was building cathedrals to house the skulls of legendary kings, the real story was anchored in a small, insignificant town in Galilee. There's a subtle linguistic detail that often gets lost in the translation of the story. When the Magi say they saw it in the east, some scholars suggest a translation that means they saw it in the first light of dawn. It's a tiny shift in perspective, but it changes the image. Instead of just looking at a map, it's about that precise moment of transition, the first light of dawn, when the darkness of the night is broken by a single, focused light. I've always found this detail striking. It suggests that these men didn't just follow a star. They were looking for something that changed their entire perception of the world. After 1,700 miles of desert and the terror of Herod, they didn't go back the way they came. They departed another way. They returned to Persia, but not as the same people who left. That's the real tension here. These men, the intellectual elite of their time, gave up everything to follow a sign. They risked their lives for a truth they didn't fully understand, but once they found it, their lives were permanently altered. It's a kind of sacrifice that feels incredibly modern, even when it is 2,000 years old. Looking back, the scale of this journey was rooted in a precision that started centuries earlier. Long before the Magi set out, Babylonian star catalogs were created during and after the Kassite rule over Babylonia, written in cuneiform script with meticulous lists of planets and constellations. The earliest of these, called 3 stars each, appeared around the 12th century BC. It divided the heavens into 3 parts: the northern hemisphere for Enlil, the equator for Anu, and the southern hemisphere for Enki, with boundaries set at 17 degrees the north and south to ensure the sun spent exactly 3 consecutive months in each third. This system relied on 36 stars, with 3 for each month. If you look at the tablets, the determiner glyph for constellation or star is Mul, a pictograph of 3 stars, and the Pleiades are specifically called Mul.Mul, or a star of stars. This intellectual lineage evolved into the Mul-A-Pin, a second formal compendium reworked around 1000 BC, named after Mul-A-Pin, the plow, identified with the current Triangulum constellation plus Gamma Andromedae. It listed 17 or 18 constellations in the zodiac, though later Babylonian catalogs reduced this set to 12, a number eventually borrowed by the Egyptians and the Greeks. By the 4th century BC, these records entered Greek astronomy via Eudoxus of Cnidus and others. The Magi weren't just dreaming, they were reading a map. In the Middle Bronze Age, Taurus, or Mul-Gu-4.Anna, marked the vernal equinox, while Leo, or Mul-Ur-Gula, marked the summer solstice. Scorpius, known as Mul Gir Tab, marked the autumn equinox, and Capricornus, or Mul Suhur Mas, marked the winter solstice. Interestingly, Capricornus was depicted as a mythological hybrid on boundary stones from before 2000 BC, as a symbol of Ea. It makes sense that the wise men were astrologers, because in antiquity, the focus was on the moving targets, the sun, moon, and planets, rather than the fixed stars, which didn't change for lifetimes. This tradition of reading omens was so ingrained that the Greeks perceived Pseudo-Zoroaster as the Chaldean founder of the Magi and the Magi's inventor of astrology and magic. While some, like the monk Dionysius Exiguus in 525, estimated Jesus was born in year 1, the death of King Herod in 4 BC proves the birth of Jesus happened earlier. The Magi's world was one of profound and extraordinary religious knowledge, though they were Magians, distinct from priests, and experts in Iranian religious traditions that were likely oral. They might have even belonged to a Median tribe. But the word Magians carries a heavy history. Starting in the 6th century BCE, Heraclitus of Ephesus used the word negatively, threatening them with tortures and fire because he saw their initiations as impious rites. Yet Aristotle of Stagira explicitly stated that Magians neither know nor practice sorcery, and Xenophon called them experts in everything religious. Xenophon noted they sang hymns to the rising sun and all known gods, and during Persian sacrifices they uttered an incantation recounting the birth of the gods. Herodotus even records them performing libations at Troy and making offerings to sea gods. He saw them as interpreters of omens and dreams in the Median court, acting as soothsayers. They had strange customs too, like not burying a male Persian until the body had been torn by a bird or a dog, or how they would kill animals, birds, snakes, and ants indiscriminately with their own hands, though they never killed dogs or men. Whether the Magi were original followers and propagandists of Zoroaster is still disputed, but ritualistic sections of the Vedavdat or Vendadat probably derive from them. By the 1st century AD, the Syriac form Magusai was used for magicians and soothsayers, chiefly from Babylonia, though some Babylonian Magi were considered outright impostors. Even royal power was at stake. In 522 BCE, a magus named Gaumeta claimed to be Bardia, the son of Cyrus II the Great, to usurp the throne. The Bisatun inscription records this revolt, calling him a Mede, the Mag in Babylonian, and Makui in Elamite. Herodotus calls this figure Smerdis, whom King Cambyses had installed as a steward. There is a linguistic mystery here too. Some scholars suggest the word Magu was an aboriginal addition to Median society, as there is no satisfactory Indo-European etymology. Émile Benveniste argues Magu signified a specific social class in the Proto-Iranian language. In the Avesta, the term for priests is Athravan, with no indisputable references to the Magi. But look at the fortification tablets from Persepolis. The Magi are frequently mentioned as recipients of rations of barley and wine. One grain handler named Makush even supplied 1,163 bar, about 11,630 quarts of barley during 1 year at Matizish for state expenses. Their lives were filled with cultic libations to rivers and mountains and sacrifices of livestock. Later, Shapur I called his priests MWGGBR squared, rendered in Greek as anthropois magois. The mathematics of the sky continues to fascinate us. Johannes Kepler observed a conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn in Sagittarius in December 1603. Because it occurred in a constellation of the fiery trigon, which consists of Sagittarius, Aries, and Leo, it was astrologically critical. By the autumn of 1604, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn formed a triangular grouping, a fiery triangle in the fiery trigon. Astrologers in 1603 had predicted this would produce a comet in 1604. Kepler believed the 1603 conjunction had occurred only 8 times since the creation of the world. We still see these patterns. The zodiac signs are divided into 4 trigons of 3 associated constellations, while Sagittarius, Aries, and Leo are the fiery trigon. Pisces, Cancer, and Scorpio make up the watery trigon. Just recently, in 2020, a similar great conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn occurred, one unlike any seen in nearly 800 years. When we look at the Magi, we see men who traveled 1,700 miles of desert, braving the paranoia of a king, guided by a map of the heavens they had studied for generations. They brought myrrh, a resin of death, to a child who would eventually die. They saw a truth that the religious leaders in Jerusalem, who wouldn't even walk 10 kilometers to Bethlehem, completely missed. The Magi didn't just find a king, they were transformed. The record says they departed another way. Most of us encountered truth and returned by the same road we came. The real question is, what are you willing to sacrifice to actually change your direction? If this journey into the ancient world resonated with you, please subscribe for more explorations.